Our Father, who art in heaven.
35.
Hallowed be thy name.
Look at this gold Christian hair.
As it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. And forgive us
for your 36. All the Christian chapters. Not one so tall, slender. 37 and no more. 37 souls. And may Allah give you joy.
His mercy is everlasting.
Of all the captives, this is the best.
The cross! Let me kiss the cross!
That one is...
Your cry shall be heard through all the world.
Now, how much will you bid for this daughter of a Christian prince? 40 dinars, you say? 40. Not enough. Who'll bid more for this Christian captive? 45. 45, 49, 45, 48.
Before we get closer, come against the command.
Silence!
Hail to Saladin, the servant of the Prophet. Declare for Saladin, all the nations. Declare for Saladin, declare for Saladin, all the nations. Declare for Saladin, declare for Saladin. Hey, infidels! Hearken to me, unbeliever, foe of Christ.
Break him down!
Let him speak. You rule here in Jerusalem. You have conquered. The Holy Land is yours. But never will you conquer this.
Break him down!
I go to all the kings in Christendom. A mighty host shall arise and arm.
Who sets foot in Asia with the sword shall not return.
The swords of a prophet will conquer.
Go, hermit. Carry your thunder across the sea. Tell your Christian kings what you have seen. Your women sold as slaves. Your knights trampled under our horses. Your gospels cast into the flames. The power of your cross broken forever.
Stop, blasphemer. I go, but I will come again. And with me shall come the great crusade. The armies of Christ shall arise and redeem his tomb. The cries of these Christian women sold into slavery shall be answered. The host of our Lord shall fall upon Islam like a mighty wave of the sea. Woe to you, unbeliever! I go to preach the great crusade.
It has become fashionable to totally condemn the Crusades as an exercise of European oppression, Christian oppression, greed, and the invasion of peaceful, advanced Muslim countries for no specifically good reason except greed and a quest for conquest and desire to destroy another religion. The recent popes, all three of the recent popes, including John Paul II, Benedict, and the current Pope Francis, have condemned or criticized severely the Crusades as being something which was a shame and embarrassment to Christianity, for which there was no good reason at all. The facts are actually quite the reverse. The Crusades were a reaction to Islamic terror and Islamic conquest and oppression of non-Islamic countries, which had gone on for centuries. By the time the Crusades started in the late 11th century, Islamic countries have conquered, and Islamic rulers have conquered, almost 2/3 of traditional Christian countries. Almost 2/3. Christianity was limited to only 1/3 of what it had been before the rise of Muhammad and Islam. And there were constant attacks on the remaining 1/3, including attacks in England, in France, in Ireland, enslavement of Christians and destroying of Christian areas. And it seemed to be that there was no stopping Islamic conquest unless something was done to stop it. And the only way to stop it, unfortunately, at that time, was force. Force meaning the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont, as a result of an appeal by Emperor Alexius Comnenus of the Eastern Roman Empire, asked for Western Christians, European Christians, to come to the aid of the Eastern Roman Empire, that is, to come to the aid of Orthodoxy, even though 1054 there had been a split between Orthodoxy and the Catholic Church. The Pope responded to the request for help from Emperor Alexius Comnenus and urged the crusade. This was the First Crusade, and the crusade started in 1096 with the First Crusaders coming over to the Holy Land and the Eastern Roman Empire, basically to save the Eastern Roman Empire, number one, from total extinction by Islamic forces, which they had clearly desired to accomplish. Total extinction was actually basically in accord with Muhammad's message as recorded in the Hadith, which is a Muslim scriptural writing, second only to the Quran, that Muslims must conquer Constantinople. Must conquer Constantinople. That was the first objective of conquest, because Constantinople was the heartland of Christianity. Constantinople was the main defender of Christianity at that time. It was the center of the Christian faith. Rome was the center of part of the Christian faith, but Constantinople was the center of all the Christian faith. And in fact, even the popes at that time actually accepted that Constantinople emperors and patriarchs were really more significant in Christianity than the popes themselves. They were totally in accord with that. This is in the 7th century. There was no break yet between Orthodoxy and the Catholic Church, and the popes accepted that the center of Christianity was in Constantinople indeed, and not in Rome. Rome was basically a center of Western Christianity, but overall center was accepted to be Constantinople and the Empress of Constantinople. A tradition that goes back to Constantine the Great and had continued ever since. And in fact, some of the later claims for the supremacy of the Pope were based on what's called the donation of Constantine, which, even though there's a lot of evidence there wasn't an actual donation, but just the argument that the popes were given certain privileges by Constantine suggests that they accepted that Constantine was in charge and that Constantinople could give special privileges to the Pope if they wished. That means that they were in charge. Only those who were in charge could give special privileges. So after Islam was organized and Muhammad died in 632, there was one invasion after another. We have the entire, within 100 years, all of North Africa, what's now North Africa. It's hard to believe for many people that all the countries of North Africa that are now traditionally Muslim, including Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, were totally Christian before Islam. And most of the countries in the Middle East were totally Christian before Islam, except for Iran, which was Zoroastrian and not Christian. So within 100 years of the death of Muhammad, Islam spread a distance from Spain all the way to China, a distance of about 7,000 miles. This was the quickest growing empire in the history of the world. There was never been an empire that grew as fast, as quick, as large as Islam grew in a short time. And by the 11th century, Islam was moving more and more. In the 9th century, they attacked Italy. And they actually, Muslim raiders attacked Rome and looted, Roman cathedrals. And actually, the Pope and his whole retinue had to hide in a fortress to escape being massacred by the Islamic raiders. And later on, they attacked Sicily. They invaded Sicily. They had conquered all of Spain. They had conquered parts of France, all of Portugal, parts of Eastern Europe, and on and on. And the conquest kept on coming. It was only after 4 centuries, more than 4 centuries, of constant Islamic invasions and attacks that Emperor Alexius Comnenus called for help. And in the Council of Clermont, in 1095, Pope Urban II asked Western countries and nobles and the people in general to help the emperor, help preserve the Eastern Roman Empire, and to help liberate the Holy Land from Islamic rule. One of the things that caused a lot of, there were many, but one of the main things that caused a lot of aggravation was in the early 11th century, Hakim, who was the ruler of Egypt and also ruled Palestine, the Holy Land at that time, destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre totally, almost totally. And pretty much he blew up parts of it, the other parts he destroyed as much as he could. And also he destroyed many other churches, and he also made it illegal for Christians to actually come for pilgrimage there. And Hakim believed, one of the reasons, according to the records, that he believed that this is the right thing to do is because he believed that the miracle of the fire in the Church of Holy Sepulchre was a phony miracle created by the monks and the priests just to fool the people. So he said he was going to put a stop of it, and he just pretty much almost completely destroyed the church to the ground. The present church was built later, rebuilt completely after the almost total destruction by Hakim. But this was knowledge that all of Europe knew. Christian Europe was aggravated by that tremendously. And later on, the church was renewed as a result of actually a war and a treaty by Emperor Constantine Monomachos, who is famous, among other things, for being prophesied that he would be emperor when he visited Chios some years before. And then, after that, Hakim destroyed many other churches as well. Now, after Hakim died, he actually, we don't know when he died. He just, according to the history, he went to the desert and disappeared. And no one really knows what happened to him. History is silent on what happened to him. But after he died, there was some revival of allowing pilgrims to come there. And the church was rebuilt by the efforts of Constantinople. But afterwards, again, there started to be more serious interference with the pilgrimage. And quite a few pilgrims were actually killed who came to Palestine, especially a bunch of German pilgrims. And this was something which was, hot news all over Europe, even though they didn't have the internet, they didn't have cable, they still heard about it, and this totally aggravated them in Europe. It's coming relatively few years after the destruction of the church and total persecution of Christians there. So in 1095, Europe was ready to come to the aid of the Eastern Roman Empire and try to safeguard or redeem parts of the Holy Land. Now, when this happened in 1095, many people today, and historians today who are politically correct, are saying that this was basically a war of the second sons, meaning that the second sons, according to the primogeniture rules of nobility, the first sons inherit everything, the second sons inherit nothing, basically. And the concept was that the second sons joined the Crusades because of the fact that they could hope to get estates and land, the property in the Holy Land, and build up their own careers. But the actual fact that is been shown by recent studies is that most of the nobles who went to the Crusades were not second sons. They were first sons, and they sacrificed a lot. They sacrificed a lot of their money, sometimes their estates, and their lives in order to redeem the Holy Land. Many kings, of course, including the Third Crusade, the most famous Richard the Lionhearted went the Crusades. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, went the Crusades. Henry and even Eleanor Aquitaine went on a crusade. She was one of the rare women who actually went to the crusade. But she was actually riding right with the soldiers who went to Palestine, the Holy Land, and went right there, risking her life with the rest of them, with her husband by her side. And this inspired Richard to actually help lead the Third Crusade, in which he actually achieved quite a bit of success, and actually received, had a treaty with Saladin, who was a Kurdish leader of Islam, that he would actually agree that Christian pilgrims could come to the Holy Land safely. And that treaty remained for the short time in effect. After Richard was killed, however, there was retrogression again. After a while, there was another crusade, and basically the country was taken over, well, part of it, Jerusalem was taken over for a while by the Crusaders, and especially one of the most famous ones was Guy de Lusignan. Guy de Lusignan, who became the Crusader king of Jerusalem. Now, the Crusaders did commit atrocities and kill innocent people, there's no doubt about it, and that should be condemned, totally condemned. But I would like to mention the fact that that in itself is not enough to nullify the defensive and constructive aspects of the Crusades. In World War II, it is clear that the Allies deliberately targeted civilians in Germany and Japan on a number of bombing raids in order to terrify and destroy the will to fight on the part of Germany and Japan. And still, I don't think that too many people would say that we should have allowed Germany and Japan to take over the world. The same thing, I might say, is we can condemn the deliberate killing of civilians by the Allies, and especially like the bombing of Dresden in World War II. I think many historians have stated that the bombing of Dresden was wrong, unnecessary. It was a totally demilitarized city. It was a cultural city, and yet it was totally destroyed by Allied bombers. About 100,000 people, civilians, were killed in Dresden. So this is far greater than the number of civilians that were killed by the Crusaders in the Holy Land. And yet, I would say that while we should condemn the deliberate killing of people who surrendered, as well as civilians, and American allies have actually killed Germans who surrendered on a number of occasions, and Japanese who surrendered on a number of occasions. And we should condemn that. We should also condemn the Crusaders' killing of civilians and soldiers who surrendered. But in neither case does that mean that their overall cause was not right. The overall cause was right. It was the defense of an entire way of life against the coming total oppression under fanatical Islam. And I could say that, right now, I've not heard of any Islamic leader who said there was anything wrong with Islamic conquests of much of the world. There are over 50 Islamic majority countries in the world right now, over 50. Almost all of them became Islamic only because of conquest, because of the sword, because the pressure on the people there to give in to Islam, to convert, to surrender, to accept, if they don't convert, secondary and tertiary status within the Islamic society. So, and this is in accord with the Quran, which has repeatedly states in it that the duty of Islam is to conquer the world until the whole world is ruled by Islam and by Allah, until everybody obeys. Well, Islamic scripture is not being misinterpreted, because all you have to do is look at the history of constant massacres, a history of cutting off heads by the thousands, of total torture, destruction of one society after another. If you read just Indian historians, which you may or may not accept, but there's a lot of evidence that there's a lot of correctness, Indian historians say that Islam, after it conquered big parts of India, almost all of India actually, over a number of centuries, killed about 90 million Hindus. 90 million Hindus. The number of people who were killed in the name of Islam far exceeds the number of people who were killed in the name of any other religion. Totally exceeds it. There's no doubt about it. And until Islamic scholars and leaders can come to terms with that and stop just accusing the West of being a total guilty party and invading Islamic countries, nothing can be settled between the Islamic cultures and non-Islamic cultures, and the war will go on between the two cultures until one or the other prevails. And Islam has a lot of advantages in this conflict, and that's one of the reasons they managed to conquer so much. One advantage is that really fundamentalists, the religious Muslims, have no doubt that they're totally correct in everything they've ever done. It's from the beginning. While Christians and non-Muslims are guilt-ridden by the Crusades, guilt-ridden by Western colonialism, guilt-ridden by everything in sight. And they do not accept that there was anything wrong with Islamic attacks on them that caused not only the Crusades, but that caused the colonial system. A lot of the colonial system was caused as a reaction of Islam. For example, a reaction to the Islamic conquest of the world. For example, when Islam conquered the Middle East totally and established total control, European countries had to find another way to reach Asia, especially China and India, for trade and other reasons. So then they started spreading out in different ways. The Portuguese actually went around Africa and to try to get around Islamic areas, and the Portuguese established colonies in southern Africa, especially Mozambique, Angola, and some other places. The Spanish, the whole reason for Columbus going and coming towards America with the Spanish conquest was to go around the Islamic corridor, Islamic wall in the Middle East, which stopped Europeans from trading with India and China. So Columbus decided, based on his studies, the way to reach India and China was to go around the world. And doing that, he actually reached the New World and allegedly discovered the New World, even though there's a lot of evidence that there was knowledge of the New World long before that. In fact, Plato actually wrote in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and others, another one, that there is another continent on the other side of the Atlantic, which is not Asia. Made it clear that wasn't Asia, so it had to be what's called the New World. But so the whole colonization of the New World is based on an attempt to get around the barriers created by Islam to trade, and also to a certain degree to try to get new allies against Islam, because Islam continued to expand. Even after the Crusades, Islam continued to attack the European countries until the 17th century. Until the 17th century, when the Turks tried to conquer Vienna and were defeated basically by the last-minute arrival of King Sobieski, Polish King Sobieski, with his cavalry, who destroyed the Turkish invasion of Vienna and helped to save Europe in the 17th century. Before that, the Serbs fought against them, the Bosnians fought against them, the Croats fought against them, but the whole thing continued until they were totally crushed. So the attacks kept on coming. And one of the reasons that West went into forming Turkish territory was to make sure that they wouldn't do it again. The concept was, by taking over, they could make sure that they wouldn't invade and try to take over again. Okay, there's a revision of history regarding the Crusades for a number of reasons, including just political correctness. Political correctness is revising everything about Western and Christian history. Basically, everything that's traditional in Western Christian history is now condemned by the politically correct crowd. It's a fad. It's a fad to be against your own culture, to be against your own country, to be against your own religion, to condemn your own religion. And this is something that's shared by the popes. The last three popes have all condemned the Crusades, criticized seriously Crusades, without even mentioning what brought on the Crusades. In fact, Pope Francis has stated, when he was asked, why doesn't he condemn Islamic terrorism? He said, well, I don't condemn Islamic terrorism because there are many Christians who do very bad things. There are Christians who do murder, Christians who destroy things, who assault people, who do bad things. However, the Pope didn't mention the fact that there's a big difference here. Okay, the Christians who do murder, who murder people, who oppress people, who steal from people, are not doing it in the name of Christ. The Muslims who are doing it in the name of Muhammad. If Christians commit atrocities in the name of Christ, they're betraying the Christian religion and the commands of the New Testament. But if Muslims, fanatical Muslims, commit atrocities in the name of Muhammad, they are being true to the preachings of Muhammad, who repeatedly say, Muhammad repeatedly said that if they oppose you, kill them. Cut off their heads. If the enemy saw Allah, cut off their heads. And there are a number of parts of the Quran, like for example, 929, Surah 929, it says, fight with them until all non-Muslims are subjected to the rule of Islam. So obviously, it doesn't mean fight with them spiritually, because the whole history of Islam is expanding Islam by the force of the sword and arms, and not spiritual. In very few places did people become Muslims as a result of conversion and preachings. Almost all the 50-odd countries that today are Muslim became Muslim because of conquest, and being either forced to become Muslim, or if they refuse to become Muslim, they will be subject to second-rate citizenship and oppression and pay special tax, being subject to slavery and all that. So it was a great incentive for them to become Muslims. The life of Muhammad is full of violence. It's based on forcing people to become Muslims. One of his first acts, actually, was to order 2 Jewish tribes in Medina to become Muslims. When they refused to become Muslims, he had all the men in those tribes, Muhammad personally ordered all their heads to be cut off, okay? And the women and children were enslaved. And he, so if you look by the actions of Muhammad, you can see what he really meant, because he did what he meant, and he meant what he did. I would say there are a number of motives. One is to be fashionable, but another one I think is fear. There's fear that if they criticize Islam too much, that Islam will become even more violent, more radical, and more dangerous. So they hope to compromise and not criticize Islam, so that the Muslims who are fanatical Muslims will do as little as possible in their fanatical quest to take over much of the world. Well, the fear is coming from the history of the last 20-odd years, with literally thousands of Islamic terrorist attacks that killed many thousands of innocent civilians all over the world, actually. So before that, Muslims were not as active terroristically as they are now. And now the history that has developed in the last 20 or 30 years has shown the capability of Muslims to do, who are fanatical, to do what is terrorism and to accomplish terrorist acts. And also, before that, many of the Muslim countries were dominated by Western imperialism. They were controlled by Western countries. And that stopped them from being able to do whatever they wanted to spread Islam, because they were defeated repeatedly by force of arms. For example, in the Sudan in the 19th century, there was a fanatical Islamic movement under the Mahdi, okay? And they killed Mahdi's forces killed many thousands of Christians and other Muslims who opposed them, and British troops. But the British came in there and destroyed the Mahdi movement and took over the Sudan totally for quite a while. Well, basically, things change for a number of reasons. One reason is increased radicalization of Muslim youth. And part of that does come from the internet, because a lot of the preachers on the internet are radicals. And people get hypnotized by the internet. But also modern technology and modern traveling, which today allows literally millions of Muslims to come to Western countries. And there, they are entitled to have all the rights, almost all the rights of citizens, and they can easily become citizens. In many cases, they are. And therefore, it's harder to know which one is radicalized, which one is not radicalized, which one is a terrorist, which is not. If you see an army advancing towards you, you know that they are all your enemies. But if you see 100,000 civilians marching towards you, which happened in Europe within the last couple of years, there's a lot of sympathy. These are civilians. We have to treat them well. They're refugees. But the fact is that while most Muslims are peaceful and most Muslims are not dangerous, many of them are coming in under false auspices, and many of them are dangerous and are coming in today when they were not there before. Today you have France, which has almost 10% Islamic population. Germany has millions of Muslims. Belgium has a lot of Muslims. England has a lot of Muslims. They're everywhere now. They're everywhere. And the fear is extreme. That's really the main reason why the West is unwilling to do much to fight them, because of the fear that if you do much, they'll become even more, then will become radicalized, more than will become fanatical, more than will become violent, and more than will become dangerous. And until we get over that fear, they will keep advancing and succeeding more and more and more. And if anybody doubts it, just look at the history of the world since Islam was established in the 7th century by Muhammad.
The battle cry has sounded. England is at war!
Mother, I must go.
Alan, my boy, you may never come back.
Mother, I may touch the wood of the true cross.
Out with your steel men! For the crusade! Good Father, consecrate these swords to the service of England, to the service of God. Amen. Let God's blessing be upon these swords. May they rescue the tomb of Christ, our Lord. May they restore to his people the cross on which he died. Amen.